Hi, it's Anna Seewald. During the month of August, I plan to take a short break from podcasting. However, the show will continue. I have selected some fantastic episodes from the past to air throughout August, and I hope you'll enjoy my choices. Did you know that August is also the podcast's birthday month? Hooray! It was 9 years ago, on August 19, 2015, when I first created the podcast. It's hard to believe it's almost been a decade. We should definitely celebrate big next year. Since 2015, Authentic Parenting has been a free resource helping thousands of people globally. The show has grown immensely, and I am incredibly grateful for it. As we celebrate the 9th anniversary of the show, I invite you to show your love and support by making a donation. We rely solely on listener support. No ads for us. So your donations are crucial in keeping the show on the air. To see suggested amounts and make a contribution today, visit authenticparenting.com/support. As a longtime listener, you probably know that Authentic Parenting also has a Patreon page. Patreon is a platform where artists, creators, and podcasters get support from their fans. While we have 21 amazing patrons currently supporting the show through Patreon, I encourage you to consider making direct donations. If you're hesitant to donate because you're wondering whether or not your contribution will make a difference, know that regardless of its size, every dollar counts. There are many costs associated with producing the show, and your support makes a tremendous difference to us. Whether it's a $5, $10, $15, or more, it truly does make a difference. We also understand that everyone's financial situation is different. If you're unable to make a donation at this time, know that we value each and every listener and deeply appreciate your continued engagement with the show. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a listener, patron, supporter, and part of the Authentic Parenting community. To make a donation today, visit authenticparenting.com/support. The first episode I have selected was first released in 2021. It's episode 296, and it's called Buddhism Meets Psychotherapy with Bruce Tift. He's the author of Already Free, a phenomenal book that I recommended and gifted to many people, including podcast guests. I just re-listened to it myself, and I have to tell you, I discovered so many new things. I really like what Bruce has to say about relationships. It's more of a philosophical conversation, but I promise you will find it stimulating, refreshing, and enlightening. One idea that stood out to me as I listened to this episode today was the notion about developing a sense of confidence as opposed to seeking a sense of safety. Now, that's a unique perspective. I find it extremely intriguing. I wish I could have asked him more about it. He also talked about becoming comfortable with the struggles of anxiety and posed an interesting question. Can you see separateness as life-giving? Please enjoy, and thank you for listening. I am Anna Seewald, and this is Authentic Parenting, a podcast about personal development in the context of parenting, where I explore how you can find more calm, connection, and joy in parenting through the process of self-discovery and inner growth with a trauma-informed lens. I'm a parent educator, and my mission is to help children by helping parents. The motto of this podcast is raising our children, growing ourselves. Today, Buddhism meets psychotherapy on the path of liberation. The core struggle for most of us is we want things to be different than they are. How can we free ourselves from unnecessary suffering and experience freedom that is already present in our lives? Ask yourself, what am I feeling right now that I don't want to feel? And is that the problem? Often we look outside ourselves for either problems or solutions. Couples, for example, blame one another. You should change so that I won't feel disturbed. Or as parents, we want our children to listen right away, behave and cooperate so that we won't feel uncomfortable, out of control. By placing the cause of our disturbance outside of ourselves, we miss the opportunity to develop a capacity to deal with our own disturbance. What is our tendency? We avoid feeling discomfort. We get wrapped up in stories and interpretations. Our normal way of operating is to relate to our embodied sensation from the perspective of our interpretations. According to my guest, the more we stay embodied with our moment-to-moment experience, the more confidence we have that we can work with whatever arises. Our practice, he says, is to learn to ride this wave of intensity, remaining embodied, while our panic is telling us, get out, we're going to die. The practice is not to manage the intensity, not to heal it, not to understand it. Rather, it's to consciously participate in the sensation level experience of it. I am speaking with Bruce Tift. He holds a master's degree in psychology and is a licensed marriage and family therapist who uses a combination of Western and Buddhist approaches. He's been in private practice since 1979, taught at Naropa University for 25 years, worked in a psychiatric ward and as a family therapist with social services, and has given presentations in the United States, Mexico, and Japan. In his 20s, he traveled for 2 years by motorcycle in Europe, North Africa, and overland to India and Nepal. He has worked as a laborer, clerk, postal worker, painter, school bus driver, paper mill worker, miner, and truck driver. He currently lives in Boulder, Colorado with his wife, and he has 3 adult children. The book is called Already Free, Buddhism Meets Psychotherapy on the Path of Liberation, and I highly recommend it. I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation and loved hearing his thoughts on intimacy, closeness, separateness, relationships, struggle and anxiety, developing embodied awareness, and personal responsibility. Please enjoy this fantastic episode with Bruce Tift. Well, Bruce, welcome to Authentic Parenting. I am delighted that you're here today.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I enjoy talking about these issues.
This book, your book, Already Free, I don't know where I heard someone recommend it. It was on a podcast, I think years ago. And then I had put it on my to-read list. And sure enough, I hadn't gotten to it, but then it kept coming up. And I said, oh my gosh, I just have to get this book. Like, what is this book? And boy, do I love this book. It's so radical, so contradictory, so enlightening, and so resonant for me. I just love it. I read it multiple times. I have highlights and sticky notes and things of this nature. And it's very deep. It's very dense. It's every time I discover new things, even though I read the same passage maybe. So it's very, and I just said, I have to have this person on the podcast. So, but I want to go back a little bit to your own history, how you discovered Buddhism.
Well,
let's go there a little bit.
in the late 60s, I started a doctoral program in clinical psychology, and it wasn't a good fit for me. And shortly after I left the country for 2 years, I picked up a motorcycle in Germany and went around Europe and North Africa and then overland to India and Nepal, which of course nowadays I wouldn't try to do, but it was very fortunate timing. And in India and Nepal, I had some sort of contact with the Tibetan community of refugees. And I was just so impressed with their sort of freshness and their energy. There didn't seem to be a lot of gender stuff going on as there was in the Indian culture. And I ended up studying with a teacher, just not real seriously, but for a couple of months, Thupten Yeshi, who's, I believe, a Gelugpa, and really resonated. When I came back to the States, I met Trungpa Rinpoche, who talked with and later became his student. And so from 71 until his death in 87, I was very involved with the Vajrayana Buddhist community here in Boulder.
And so there are different types of Buddhist directions, right? So Vajrayana is one of them. What are the other two, I think, right?
Yes, well, it's sort of like Christianity, probably. There's so many, and they all have different takes on things. But from a certain point of view, the original sort of understanding of Buddhism is nowadays called Theravada or sometimes Hinayana. And it traditionally is very focused on personal liberation, personal responsibility, very foundational work. And my understanding, which I'm not a scholar, but my understanding is that several hundred years later, what's called Mahayana Buddhism arose as an extension of the Theravada view. And beyond personal liberation, the Mahayana view extends to the idea that as long as we are focusing mostly on our own, enlightenment or wakefulness or freedom, there can remain a subtle dualism where we're protecting our accomplishments from the reality of suffering that surrounds us. That's one way of saying it. So it doesn't mean that Theravada students or teachers necessarily are caught in that dualism, but that view takes that idea. So the Mahayana view is much more of an inclusive view, and it's not only inclusive of other people, but it's also inclusive of a wider range of emotional experience. So almost anybody is going to start any path by wanting to have positive experience and get rid of negative experience. But a Mahayana view takes the position that all of our experience is our experience, and we will probably progress most quickly and be of greater benefit to other people if we can train ourselves to relate to what we call negative experience, as equally valid as what we call positive experience. And then my understanding is several hundred years later, out of that view, what's called Vajrayana arose. That is historically, I believe, sort of a coming together of a Mahayana view with Tantra. And from that point of view, we not only are sort of kind and accepting of difficult experience, but we go into it as deeply as possible, experientially, and congruent with the Mahayana view, perhaps discover no evidence of essential nature in any of our experiencing. And so Vajrayana is much more about almost a celebration of relative experience, of form, of even neurosis, and much more of a focus on immediacy. In another way of saying it, in more of our language, my understanding, which may not be an official Buddhist view, is that I would see Theravada as addressing attachment or passion, or in our language, maybe neurotic feminine as the major obstacle, with healthy masculine energy, separateness, as the antidote. it turns out that's not the whole picture. So then in Mahayana, we actually address neurotic masculine or anger as the obstacle with healthy feminine energy connecting. And then in the Vajrayana view, we hold both what we call masculine and feminine separateness connection simultaneously with no fantasy of resolution ever, and bring our attention more and more to this very intense, unresolvable experience sort of in between those apparent polarities or reference points.
Yeah, that part is resonant with me, because then there's acceptance and peace with that, right? With life. You can just exist and live your life.
As long as you're willing to be at peace with exactly the feelings you organized your life avoiding, yes.
Yeah, in theory, it sounds great.
Yeah, in theory, it sounds good.
Yes. And so in your work, in your psychotherapy practice, you do practice, well, in your book, you describe the developmental view and the fruitional view. And of course, the title of your book, the subtitle, Buddhism Meets Psychotherapy on the Path of Liberation. So I know it's a lot to go into describing what developmental view is and what fruitional view is. But when someone comes to your office, do you, number one, this is what I want to know, do you tell them about your approach, the developmental view, the fruitional, and obviously you combine this, right? Sort of like a dance between the two. That's my understanding. Do you tell your clients or your patients about your approach, or you just work with them?
I tend to just hop on in and do my best to try to be of benefit to both what they're presenting, but also my best assessment of what they're not aware of. So there's also sort of a dance between that. I don't usually explain the theories unless somebody asks about it. And if they're curious, I often just say, well, there's a lot of stuff online. You can check it out. You can look at my book if you want to. But I tend to see experience as carrying more of a potential for transformative change than just theories. So I prefer that somebody actually is brought into engagement with a certain type of experience or view. And then if they're curious about that, then it might be helpful to have some more of a intellectual understanding.
Mm-hmm. Of course, the book has a very Buddhist title, right?
Right. Yes.
So you are.
Yes.
It signals that you are in your heart more of a Buddhist. You promote the fruitional view.
Yes, that is my bias.
Yes, that is your bias. I like that bias. So, is it possible for you to give a short overview, a brief summary of the two approaches?
Well, sure. We could probably say it in a couple sentences and then keep elaborating it for hours. But one way of talking about the developmental view is the idea, which I happen to agree with, that our very young experience tends to lay a foundation or a template that's based on our efforts to take the very best care of ourselves possible. But a healthy response to a distorted or dysfunctional environment requires a distorted or dysfunctional survival strategy. The inspiration is health, but the form tends to be distorted in some way or another. That's a very healthy process, but none of us really have fully mature, engaged, wakeful parents, at least that I've met. So it's just a matter of degree to which, as children, unconsciously, we have to sacrifice aspects of ourselves that do not fit with our emotional environment, especially, to get the most love and approval and avoid the most attack and abandonment. And that works, so it becomes internalized over time as actually what we call character structure, and operates somewhat unconsciously, is carried into adulthood. And for most people will be their unexamined sort of style or strategy for the rest of their life in trying to take the best care of themselves possible. It's not pathological. It's just usually out of date by several decades. And by some time somebody's an adult. So a lot of Western therapy could be understood as investigating and, in a variety of ways, challenging or offering alternatives to our unexamined tendency to continue living as an adult as if we were still a child in our family of origin, and instead bring us into more and more congruence with current adult capacities and also current adult realities. And as we bring ourselves more into alignment with what's most true, we reduce unnecessary suffering and confusion.
So that's the developmental view.
Right. Yes. Short version.
Short version. Yes. And the fruitional view?
Fruitional view, obviously, is coming out of a Buddhist type of orientation, and it's not really part of our culture. So it's not a familiar idea. So it should be examined, and people, I think, will best take it as a view at first and try some experiments, think about it, maybe do some study if they want, let some time pass and see for themselves, basically, if it's helpful, because it's not going to help if somebody thinks they're supposed to take it on as a belief system, especially because it's a little alien to most of us. But that view asserts that all of our experience is being continually constructed, that none of us have a direct experience of what we call reality, that as limited embodied life forms, we're only going to consciously and even unconsciously have experience that is through our senses, our perceptions, our emotions, and our thoughts. And by the time we are dealing with that experience of reality, it's a very constructed experience. And that construction is not a one-time achievement. It's actually, because we're only living in the present moment ever, it's a constant activity of creativity and effort and discipline, actually, to constantly generate a version of reality. So a lot of Buddhist practice has to do initially with a process of deconstruction, where we investigate in our immediate experience how we are generating the appearance of a monolithic, objectively existing reality, sense of self, so on. And as we get more and more clear that this is an ongoing process of construction, it gets harder and harder to actually be identified with any of those constructions. And from a Buddhist point of view, at some point we even start to pay attention to how our sense of self is also being continually constructed and perhaps has no objective essential nature to it, no ongoing continual reality. Again, that's not familiar in our culture. A Vajrayana, that's common, I think, to most forms of Buddhism. A Vajrayana view, which is what I'm referring to with a fruitional view, is that upon investigation, what we may discover is that open awareness is what is always present, is our most basic and most intimate experiencing, and that the nature of this open awareness is just open. So you can't really capture it with thoughts or with senses. It can't be captured. It can't be understood conceptually. We can't make it about us, but we can participate in it. But that's a difficult sort of path for most of us. But the Vajrayana view is that where we're starting from is our immediate experience, where we believe we want to move toward is an experience of freedom. And this view asserts that the experience of freedom is not different from our immediate experience, but it turns out to be how we relate to our immediate experience. So in Buddhist jargon, it's sometimes called ground, path, fruition. Ground is where we're starting from. Fruition, which is where that word comes from, is where we want to end up. And path is how we get from here to there. But rather than, like many traditions, getting from here to there is not seen as happening over time, but only happening in the present moment. And so our path work, our practices are mostly about relaxing into more and more immediate, embodied, non-interpretive experiencing, and see for ourselves what is most basic and what is always present, which from this view turns out to be open awareness. And then freedom is one way of talking about it, is that freedom could be understood as a conscious participation in the experience of open awareness, whereas confusion has to do with not participating in what's already most fundamental in our experience.
Hence the title of your book, Already Free.
Right.
So
Exactly.
we're not resolving anything. We're not going to a place through this whatever journey
Right.
to get free. We are already free.
But that's an assertion that people need to check out rather than believe or do as affirmations or something.
Yeah. Well, on a practical level, of course, it's very hard. So in your work with clients, do you see any value in hearing the clients, childhood stories, what happened, what they went through, traumas? Do you find value in that? As I understand we don't want to work the past. I am also of that belief that, there's no point in going and working on the past issues. The past is in the past, right? As you said, and some of our patterns and those conditioned behaviors, I don't remember exactly what you said, are like a few decades old. Do you find value in that, in sort of integrating the person's story?
Well, again, I'll be a little long-winded in my response. One understanding of path from a Vajrayana point of view is a continual engagement of form and formlessness, or our identification with our experience with practices that interrupt that identification. So we could say, applying that view to therapy, we could say that therapy from this perspective could be understood as bringing one's identification with one's conditioned history into contact engagement with immediacy. And so from that point of view, it's very helpful potentially to be very clear about these patterns, to have some understanding of their origin, which is always speculative, but can be helpful, so that we can challenge our identification more accurately and probably skillfully when somebody realizes that, let's say, a history of feeling controlled or abandoned has its origins probably in lifelong experience, especially from a young child, then it's less likely that they will claim that some current circumstance or relationship is the cause of those difficult feelings, and hopefully more willing to take complete responsibility for working with that issue because they're the location of it. And that's a very sort of Theravada Hinayana foundation, is personal responsibility. So we stop disempowering ourselves by claiming that something outside of ourselves is the cause and therefore should be the solution. So when somebody is aware of their history, often they can examine more accurately whether it's still a useful version of reality with which to take care of themselves now. On a more subtle level, maybe, it seems to me that our experience of our past, our identification with our conditioned history, can either help us in our practices of coming into immediacy, which is the only moment we're ever living in, or can be an obstacle to conscious participation in immediate experience. Basically, sanity has the quality of being more open and fluid, more shaky, more difficult to get a hold of. Neurosis has more of a quality of being dense and contracted and problematic. And so because neurosis carries this feeling that we are being threatened, we tend to maintain our self-absorption more as a type of primitive protection. Sanity is more open to immediate experience because we have more confidence that we're workable and therefore that our life is workable. So it seems to me that sanity is a more practical, effective support for investigating the nature of awareness than neurosis. And often it's very, as we were just saying, often it's very helpful to understand that what we call neurosis is our best effort to take care of ourselves. So it's not bad or wrong. It's just probably several decades out of date. And maybe we can tolerate much more intensity now as an adult than we could as a kid. So maybe we could risk bringing our conscious participation more into immediacy. Whereas as a kid, it wasn't safe to do that.
Yeah. When you step into the immediate experience of this moment, it could be anxiety provoking. It is anxious, right? That experience. For a lot of people, they may not be able to remain present with the discomfort of their feelings. Hence, we want to avoid, distract, do all sorts of behaviors to avoid feeling that. But you're inviting us to remain with that experience without any interpretation from the past. Because when you start to give context and create a story and a narrative, you keep turning and turning and turning it in your head. And right. And then that becomes your main story. And people become very attached to those rehearsed stories. They have a hard time parting from them because in some ways, like you said, it serves them. Maybe it served a purpose back then, 30 years ago, but what kind of purpose is it serving now? If a couple is arguing, let's say, and one party says, you are not considerate, I feel abandoned, you're not emotionally available, you don't feel close to me, or whatever the complaints are, there is usually you made me feel a certain way, right?
Right.
You made me feel a certain way.
Sure.
This is like my pet peeve of this. We sort of lose our power, right? And we place it outside of ourselves. So I want you to speak about this just a little more, about taking personal responsibility, which is so resonant with me. And I heard you say in one interview that it's a form of self-abandonment.
Yes.
Right? So I want you to speak about this. This is very crucial.
Okay.
Do people cause negative feelings in us, or they just touch our boo-boos from the past?
Right. Yes. Well, it's obviously a very big issue, but first of all, I have the view that our current neurosis is not, of course, actually about the past. It's only happening in the present moment. It's being created as our best effort to take care of ourselves. And so I prefer to reframe people's out-of-date strategies not as not serving them or self-sabotage or something like that. Instead, just as, hey, you're still trying your best to take care of yourself, and in a way that is putting probably safety and security as a higher priority than aliveness and growth. And that's not wrong. Everybody wants security. Mm-hmm. But the real question is, how can I actually have the most effective sense of safety or security or confidence? And once we have more awareness as an adult, we might want to look at cultivating a sense of confidence rather than what some people believe, which is that they need to feel safe. So in our society, of course, there's some, theme of people needing to feel safe. Well, life isn't safe, so that's never going to happen. But from a Buddhist point of view, we can develop and move toward what could be called unconditional confidence, which isn't feeling safe, but it's a commitment and over time, a trust that I will show up and work with anything I'm experiencing, including feeling unsafe. So there's no pick and choose about it. So if somebody wants to develop that sense of confidence in themselves, then of course, it's pretty important to do the work of, from a Western point of view, of regaining experiential responsibility of exactly what intelligently we had to disown growing up. Because as part of the price tag of that young survival strategy is that we come into adulthood almost always with a sense that there is part of us that's unworkable, dangerous, shameful, overwhelming, not workable. And that generates a sense of being divided against oneself, being a problematic person. From a Buddhist point of view, it sort of feeds the constant generation of self-absorption. And that self-absorption could be understood as a very sort of primitive foundation for what we call ego or egoic process. So when we have disowned aspects of ourself and come into adulthood, all of us still want the experience of being whole, whatever that means, not divided. And we have moments of that. So we sort of know intuitively it's possible. But around very young survival strategies, yes, it's very anxiety provoking to mess with one's familiar ways of taking care of oneself, especially when as a child, it was actually about emotional survival. It wasn't about quality of life. It's like I could be annihilated if I have to feel like an abandoned person. So I'm going to specialize in always trying to have connection. And then I won't feel so much of what's already true because I'm constantly distracting myself with the project of trying to get connection. So then if that person that you referred to hypothetically comes into adulthood, they might have this unconscious project. I am that person who's always trying to get the connection that I will never get. And that just provides endless distraction that serves to distract ourselves from what's most true, which is I feel like an abandoned person. Sorry, I got stuck with it. I'm not going to just make that go away. What that person is really trying to get away from is their feeling of separateness, because they had a feeling of separateness as synonymous with abandonment. They don't see separateness as life-giving and a strength of personal power and so forth. So that person will tend to believe that they really want connection. But if they really wanted connection, connection's always there. So that person is unconsciously focusing on what's missing, which is an unconscious way to deal with their experience of being separate, but without taking direct responsibility for it. I hope this isn't too abstract.
No, it's maybe for the listener. And I don't know how we can help the listener. If not for me, I read and listened to your work. So I understand. I think I do. I understand. And it resonates with me in my work as well. And from my personal experience, I can see how I have had unnecessary sufferings around this issue of abandonment and connection and closeness. And it's hard to swallow for someone who is yearning for connection.
Well, they claim
right?
they claim they are.
Yeah.
But if they start examining their experience, they may find out that they're always ensuring that they never feel adequately connected with, which then allows them to maintain their project of being that person who's yearning for love and approval and connection that they will never get. That's like a stabilized struggle.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So we are already free. We are already whole, and we have no problems. This is a good place to start work with someone. But what if the person doesn't believe in that? They have doubts, and
well, I would hope so.
Then how do you walk someone to help them gain confidence that they are indeed whole, that they can take personal responsibility, that we are fundamentally alone and vulnerable in this world?
Well, I would personally say fundamentally, we're both alone and completely connected simultaneously. So separateness and connection to me are both halves of our human experience, and especially important when trying to cultivate healthy adult intimacy. But as far as my work with people, I don't have an agenda of saving them from their life. That would be trying to do exactly what I'm encouraging them not to do in their relationship to save their partner. So I work with people as if they're adults who are responsible for dealing with their own experience. I try my best, which is, of course, is limited, to be the location of awareness rather than to be an agent of change. So my agenda isn't to help them change, although that, of course, is helpful on a relative level, as we touched on earlier. Sanity is more useful than neurosis. But my basic intention is to be, as much as possible, the location of awareness, so that we can talk about history, we can talk about their conviction of being a victim or feeling guilty about being angry. But to the extent possible, I don't try to help them have a different sense of themselves as much as investigate whatever it is they are claiming to be their identity drama in a more immediate, as you said earlier, a non-interpretive way. And my bias, which I think is resonant with a Buddhist view, is that I invite people over and over again to bring their attention to immediate embodied sensation level experience with absolutely no interpretation, no commentary, no explanation, and see if it's going to kill them, let's say, to feel abandoned, because I've never found a sensation of abandonment.
Or shame, or any
of those things. Yes. That doesn't make our conditioned history go away, but it starts to provide contrast, which is what our intelligence works with. So we can find out for ourselves, rather than me convincing them, what is most true in the moment, which is the only moment I'm living in. What is most true, that when I feel abandoned, actually my stomach's tight, my heart hurts, I feel activated, I want to run away, or that I'm an abandoned person and my partner is not giving me what they could, and here it is again, nobody's ever there for me, what's the point, like that. What is most true? So when somebody is willing to come into embodied immediacy, it's actually stepping out as a practice, not an achievement. It's stepping out of our identification with our conditioned history into immediacy. And then we have the opportunity to see what is most accurate right now.
Yeah, there's freedom in that, because you are freeing yourself from that hefty thing that you're carrying. Does this appeal to clients? Number one question. Or it just turns them off? It appeals to me a lot.
Okay, yeah.
And how, of course, there is various degrees and every person is different. But from your experience, the people who commit to this work with you, how quickly do they grasp this notion and start to practice being this embodied immediacy, this experience, embodied awareness, and being present moment to moment? I'm curious, what's that process like for people from your experience?
Yeah, well, first of all, obviously, no style of therapy is a best fit for everyone. And that's certainly true for my style, because it's not really culturally congruent, first of all. And I happen to be a guy, and I have a lot of aggressive energy, which I've tried to use for the benefit of people, but I do tend to be challenging. I don't just offer people a warm, supportive, nurturing environment within which to talk about their experience. I interrupt people and ask them, hopefully in a adequately kind way, but ask, why are they pretending to be a victim? Do they think how's that benefiting them? And again, always returning to the foundational practice of personal responsibility. And so, of course, some people, who knows why, resonate and find that approach helpful. Some people I might work with once and they never come back again. So I support that, because why waste their time and money style that's not helpful? And why should I waste my time trying to get somebody to agree with me if it's not a good fit for them? So people tend to self-select themselves in or out of my work, which I support completely. And I never know. There are people who are longtime spiritual path practitioners who are very profoundly defended and very invested in their version of reality. And there's people who've never been in therapy before who say, whoa, gosh, that makes sense. I've never thought about it that way. And in maybe a few sessions are reporting, anyway, some very significant shifts and more lightness, more clarity, less drama, less struggle, things like that. Of course, most people are going to be somewhere in between.
How about from your personal experience? When did you embrace this embodied immediacy yourself? And what was your experience with that?
Well, unlike maybe some people's reports, I never experienced a sort of an earth-shaking sort of reorganization of my experience. Some people have that. For me, it's been more like a very gradual evolution over, I'd say, well, I started that. I met Trungpa Rinpoche, let's say, in 71, so 50 years. And I've had certainly some very useful experiences that have reorganized my understanding of things, but that's been hand in hand with a lot of very difficult, provocative life circumstances that I've learned from incredibly as well. Like my wife and I actually met at Naropa Institute, a Buddhist-based school, in 77. We've been married 42 years now. I have 3 daughters. And I would say being married and being a parent has probably been equally supportive of my personal evolution or maturation, because it's very difficult to sort of take refuge in some spiritual fantasy land when you're in an intimate relationship or you're parenting. So those life experiences, being a therapist, has just always brought me into relationship with my limitations and my strengths. But then my experience of being a student of Trungpa Rinpoche was profound. And I've had the good fortune of at least being in contact with other teachers. And I don't think my life experience would have been sort of potentiated in the same way without my Buddhist practice. But my Buddhist practice probably would not be grounded in the messiness of my human experience without relationship and so forth.
Yeah. You always hold those contradictory ideas in mind. This is your style. This is your approach, right? There is no resolution or solution in life, right?
That's my opinion.
Yeah, but most people are seeking that because I guess it gives people comfort, right? Even in child rearing.
It gives temporary comfort.
Temporary comfort. You're right. Even in child rearing, we don't know what our children's path is going to be. It's the most unknown experience, right? We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. We always have the illusion of control, I think, and that temporary comfort.
It is illusory, meaning it's a vivid appearance, but upon investigation of immediacy, we never find any solid ground to stand on. So this is a very Buddhist view that all of our experience arises between and within reference points. We could say that what we call immediate experience, we use that language, but that's always happening between our more form level sense of past and future. We could say that our engagement with our life always is arising between self and other. We can never pin that down where that is. In our therapy work, we could say we're always between acceptance and improvement. So all of our experiences in this very disturbing, intense, groundless immediacy that can't be defined, actually. In Tibetan Buddhism, that's called bardo. And in the religious sense, it's about what happens when you die. But in the psychological sense, it just means that every moment of our life is actually happening between reference points. And there's no support for personal identity in groundlessness. And so, of course, as long as we're identified with being a significant self, we're going to be freaking out and always looking for a reference point to stand on, a position to take. And that's a very fundamental sort of expression of what we call neurosis, which could be understood among a variety of ways as an effort to avoid the truth of our experience, especially disturbing experience. So taking a position is just a more subtle version of having a drink if you're disturbed, or smoking a joint, or meditating or exercising to get out of disturbance. So our practice from this point of view is always returning to the disturbance of groundlessness or openness and finding out, hopefully, it's not going to kill us to not know who we are ever, to not know how to be the best parent, to not know what intimacy is, not know the meaning of life. But again, that's not exactly our cultural preference.
Of course not. Just turn on the TV and they're selling, there's a solution for every disturbance,
Exactly.
every problem that you have.
Sure.
Right?
Yes, that's our consumer economy. Yeah.
So how can someone begin being with their immediate experience? Do you just plunge into it? Because it can be overwhelming. Like for me, for example, this sense of anxiety, when I'm alone in a public place, in narrow places and things of this nature. And I used to use the interpretive mind. I had this view of, this is because I was stuck in an earthquake, this is why, like being in a narrow hallway in a dark place or in a whatever, this is why I feel this way. But it's no use to me in that moment. I'm still freaking out. I still have this anxiety that is overwhelming and I feel like I'm going to die.
Right.
Of course, not all of our experiences in the immediate moment are so severe, like a panic attack, right? So there is a different range. But if someone wants to start to, experience this embodied immediacy, what would you recommend? I don't know if you even want to use the word recommend, but where do we start?
I don't mind. Yeah, of course. Yeah. I mean, nobody's going to do any of these practices if they don't want to improve their experience. So we have to talk in that language. Mm-hmm. The point is just not to take it completely seriously. But different people have different philosophies and languages and life experiences. So within my limitations, I do my best to try to speak in that person's world of meaning. But of course, I'm very limited. But I often, first of all, if I'm working with somebody, just continually, I'm curious about their story about why they're there in therapy, because it usually means they have an intuition that somehow they're involved with creating unnecessary suffering for themselves. So there's already that intuition there. Then I usually will keep returning a person off and on to a question of, well, what is going on right at this moment? And if you just bring your attention to your sensation, what do you find? Is there any problem, any harm or damage? Not to take it as a belief system, but what do you actually find? But then if somebody is interested in bringing that into daily life, where I think there's a greater potential for transformative change rather than just an hour a week or every week, a couple of weeks in therapy, then I suggest a more general practice of just being curious about that question, what am I actually experiencing right now? And see if you can stay out of stories about it. If somebody doesn't find that question arises spontaneously, then they might set their watch or whatever, their phone, to beep every hour, or they might ritualize a practice like in the morning for 10 minutes, in the evening for 10 minutes or something, or join a meditation group if that's appealing to them. And then once somebody starts to gain some familiarity and confidence that actually stepping into that sort of anxiety of openness apparently is not going to harm them. If they're interested, then I suggest they can take on proactive practices as they clarify, what have I organized my life around not feeling, like, let's say, abandonment or rage or something. Then once a day, 10 times a day, whatever, they can evoke those feelings with a memory or a fantasy, like you could remember the earthquake thing, have that panic come up, and then same practice, just drop the trigger, the memory, the fantasy, come back to sensation. Where's the harm? Where's the damage? Where's there any evidence that this is permanent? Where's any evidence about my worth as a person? And instead, what we find, I believe, is this sort of wave-like life of its own that our emotional intensity has. I have heard, I don't know if it's true, that the life of an emotion in the brain has about 90 seconds. So if we can not keep throwing fuel on that fire with our stories, it's possible that we can learn that we don't have to do anything about our emotional intensity. It's going to come and go all by itself, but that has to be experienced. It can't be just an idea. But as we gain that confidence, then we can intentionally keep evoking exactly what we don't want to feel so that we accelerate our capacity to bring ourselves into what is actually true in the moment rather than what used to be true in our past, or on another level, our identification with our evolutionary biology. Because given like negativity bias of the brain, the amygdala getting triggered, all that stuff, we should assume that our nervous system is probably going to operate on a better safe than sorry basis. But for those of us anybody listening to this discussion is almost certainly living a more than biological life. And so our biology, we have to experience, respect, stay with, not abandon. But our biology probably is not the best guideline for our complicated, largely social lives nowadays. And so if we want to live at higher levels of human potential, we have to experience our biology, but gradually learn not to be captured by it. And one way is just, in the West, it might be called like a desensitization process, where we keep becoming so familiar with our disturbance that we gradually, incrementally learn that it's not synonymous with harm. Or sometimes an analogy I offer to people is that this proactive practice where we intentionally imagine being trapped in a life-threatening situation could be understood like a immunization or a homeopathic process, where we're actually introducing in small little bits what it feels toxic. So our immune system, in this case, our emotional, energetic immune system, becomes so familiar with working with it that when life does actually trigger us, hopefully we're developing some resilience in working with that.
And life will trigger us, right?
Of
Those
course.
triggers are always going to be part of our biology.
Yes, exactly. And our conditioned history and our culture and our gender training. I mean, it's very complex, but my bias is that I think it's smart to just assume that our anxiety will be triggered off and on every day of our life until we die, and give up some fantasy of a life without anxiety.
Yeah. Recently, I went to a nail salon and, out of a blue, I feel anxious. I'm sitting there. Everything is normal in my world.
Right.
I don't have problems. The weather is beautiful. I'm treating myself. Yet I'm sitting there feeling, I'm trying to be in my body. I have this embodied practice as much as possible. And, I feel where it is, the anxiety and all that. But my mind somehow goes, why am I feeling anxious? Like there is no apparent reason. And so I try to abandon that thought and remain with the bodily sensations and observe it. And it's not pleasant whatsoever.
No,
and I am trying to have a pleasant day, right? I'm treating myself to a pedicure. It's a beautiful day. I finish my work. But there is this lingering discomfort and disgusting feeling that I wanted to just run out of there and,
of course,
and just go. But I stayed but my mind keeps going to a story. Maybe you're hungry. Maybe it's your low iron. Maybe you didn't drink enough water. Maybe it's this. And I was trying very hard to not to be interpretive. And then the point of this story is then I finished the pedicure, then I'm doing this manicure after like maybe 15, 20 minutes. Then I notice, I'm like, where is that anxiety? It's not there anymore. I'm like, I was like panicking and freaking out 15, 20 minutes ago. I'm like, this stuff is like temporary. But if only we can remind ourselves that this is temporary and it has no meaning in the moment whatsoever, right?
Yes.
It's not related to anything. It's not like I have a problem or maybe there is a problem I should be worrying about, right? No, it's just a sensation that arises for whatever reason. Be with that. And it passes and you get relief. And yeah, that's my point. That it's temporary.
Yes. Yes. That sounds like a very good practice to me. And it's not easy.
No.
And so that's related to one of my views, which is that I think that in any given moment, especially of disturbance, that neurosis is always easier than sanity. Our effort to escape disturbance is always going to be attractive. Taking ourselves into our disturbance is always going to go against our evolutionary biology, not to mention our culture, blah, blah, blah. So I see sanity itself as a counter-instinctual practice, not an achievement, but a practice that not always, but really at the heart of it, requires an attitude of discipline, because it means I am committing to using my best understanding to go 180 degrees from what so much of my nervous system and my culture and my personal history says, get out of here, we're going to die, and instead do 180 and go directly back into voluntarily exactly what I don't want to feel. That's when we potentially discover, as you did, it's first of all, it's impermanent. Second of all, there's no inherent meaning. And from a Buddhist point of view, even on a deeper level, we may discover there's actually no essential nature. It's just a vivid appearance that we don't have to heal or understand or communicate or process or anything like that about. We just have to not abandon our own self experience, as you said earlier, because then usually we end up doing to ourselves what happened to us in some variety or another as a child. And then we perpetuate an out-of-date sort of belief that our fears are bigger than us. So part of our adult work is to gradually learn experientially that we are larger than our fears.
Yeah, and it doesn't mean that I will never experience anxiety.
Well, you should count on it every day, I think.
Yes, and I don't know when it may arise.
Right.
And in fact, it arose yesterday. I was walking and there was this old church. I said, let me enter into this church. I always wondered what the church is like. The moment I entered into this church, I was like, wow, Anna, run away. Don't stay here. And I said, no, I'm going to stay, I'm going to stay. And it was very momentary. It wasn't gripping or overwhelming. It was just a mild form. So do you think with practice, with staying embodied, and you say it's a discipline, it's a commitment, and we gain confidence each time we practice this embodied immediacy, do you think those sensations will not be as strong with time?
I think that, well, you've probably heard this sort of slogan sort of floating around in spiritual communities, that pain is part of life, but suffering is optional. So that's sort of an understanding of the nature of neurosis, that if we would like less unnecessary suffering, we commit to the staying present and participating in actual human disturbance, pain, anxiety, grief, rage, sadness, all that. So first of all, it's very possible to reduce unnecessary suffering.
But so that implies, I'm sorry, that there is necessary suffering.
Yes, it does.
It does? You have to say a few words about that.
Well, because we are sensitive, organic, biological life forms, we are vulnerable. Any life form is vulnerable. It can be harmed or killed at any second, and we are powerless actually to prevent that from happening. It's just when and how, and we try to reduce it. So we all live with that inherent vulnerability. And because we have bodies, we're going to have pain. Because we are in relationships, we're going to have hurt feelings. If we're a parent, we're going to feel all sorts of our heart breaking when we can't save our children from their pain. If we have been raised in a society, we're going to have outrage about injustice and the suffering that happens unnecessarily in the world, and on and on. We don't get a life without pain. It's just a fantasy. But if you have a body, you're going to have pain. But if you have a mind, you're going to have the capacity to have a fantasy of a life without pain. And there's some tension there that we have to work with.
Yeah. I love this. I love this. It's it's so profound. I also, before I let you go, I want to ask you about, your view on intimacy, closeness, connection. I also love what you have to say about that topic. Yeah. Okay.
I mean, that we could go hours, of course, days on that, but a simple version might be, if we return to the view that all of our experience arises between reference points, a very fundamental reference point for all of us is self and other. And our experience is always happening in between. We can never really tell when another person's behavior is just about them or when it turns into our experience about their behavior, for example. It's always somewhere in this groundless middle. That's very disturbing to us. So most of us unconsciously, and especially as young kids, given our families' limitations, want to take a position. And so it's not resolvable that we're always self, which is like a separateness, and there's always other, which has to do with connection. So an unconscious effort I think all of us tend to make is that we focus on one of those sides and tend to ignore the other as a way of trying to have a formula, a ground to stand on, a familiar sense of self or something. When we focus on self and discount or ignore other, we generate a sense of being separate. When we focus on other and tend to erase or ignore our own self, our own experience, we tend to focus on connection. The first is neurotic masculine, the second neurotic feminine, to use that language if people don't mind that nowadays. But we could just say separateness and connection. So most of us enter adulthood out of balance, being identified with feeling, oh, I have to take care of myself and I need to sort of ignore other. Or I have to really focus on other people, like being a caretaker, and I can't really feel selfish, for example. In the extreme version, that sort of all or nothing organization leads to the neurotic feminine extreme of victim, or the neurotic masculine extreme of perpetrator. A more healthy possibility is more figure ground rather than either or, so that we might lead with connection, but we stay in experiential contact with our separateness, our boundaries, our personal responsibility, our integrity, or we're leading with separateness as in conflict, but we stay in experiential contact with our empathy, our care for that person. We know we're having conflict with them because they're important to us. So we want to move away from all or nothing, black or white organization, which is a young possibility. And then when we enter adulthood, mysteriously, because we all want that sense of not feeling divided, we tend to, most couples in my experience, tend to mysteriously find a partner who specializes in exactly what we have disowned in ourselves. So if I've disowned my separateness, mysteriously, I might end up with a partner who specializes in trying to be self-sufficient and independent and always sort of pulling back from my wish for more emotional engagement, things like that. And if it's a good codependent fit, of course, my partner is probably disowned from their connection or dependency and is hiring me to be the one who's always trying to make connection. And so initially we feel more whole, but we're still in the child's world of looking outside of ourselves for that wholeness. And our aggression toward that disowned part of ourself over a few years starts to get expressed as aggression toward our partner for being exactly who we've hired them to be. And so this is one understanding of what we call codependency, is that each of us is hiring our partner to be the apparent location of exactly what we are uncomfortable with in ourselves and still refusing to take personal responsibility for working with. In my experience, that sort of inappropriate mutual projection is experienced unconsciously as emotional fusion, as inappropriate, inaccurate entanglement, which we're not willing to really give up. So then most couples, in my experience, tend to ritualize their relationship with a variety of problems like chronic conflict, miscommunication, loss of sexuality, parent-child dramas, turning into buddies, running the family if there's kids, absorption at work, absorption of parenting, all of which have distancing functions. Those distancing functions provide relief from the underlying emotional fusion, but because the fusion operates unconsciously and the problems operate consciously, almost all couples come to therapy with the belief that their problem is not enough connection. But maybe it's exactly the opposite, and there's too much inappropriate entanglement or connection. That's why I would say personal responsibility in this view could be understood as the antidote, initially, the foundational practice, the antidote to codependent dynamics. But that's not what a lot of couples believe the problem to be. They think they need more connection. That's a lot of theory all at once.
No, I have like so many thoughts and questions. Yeah, when they come to therapy, a couple comes to therapy, and this one party says, and it's usually the woman,
right? Or the person with feminine energy, I would say.
Who is hammering on this point that we need more connection. We're not emotionally connected. So how do you help that person to like generate insight about their own unconscious patterns? I forgot what the word you used.
Well, it depends on my intuition about that person, their language, their meaning, and so forth, like I said. But generally, I introduce the idea that healthy intimacy perhaps requires this never resolvable disturbance between always feeling separate and always feeling connected. And it's not negotiable. They're always there. But that maybe healthy intimacy requires this alternation between self-care and care for one's partner. And then I might, if they're interested, talk about the mutual projection, the hiring each other thing. But on a personal level, I might point out that the person who's claiming that they, often a she, but I'd say about, at least in Boulder, probably about a third of the men I work with are more organized around feminine energy or connecting energy and vice versa. So whoever that is, I might point out that if they really want connection, all they have to do is join their partner's reality. Then they'll feel connected. Well, they don't want that. They want their partner.
That requires personal responsibility.
And if I join my partner's responsibility, I support them being separate. Well, I don't want that. No, I want my partner to join my reality.
Yeah.
But that's their separateness. And
I hear this a lot. That I want my husband to take the initiative. I want him to plan something fun for us to do. I want him to do this. I want him to do it. But like, what's your role in this? If you're the one wanting it, right? Why aren't you being proactive towards it? No, he should do it.
Yes, well, that's their disguised separateness. Because they're demanding that the other person join their reality, which is putting self at the center, and they're focusing on everything that's missing, which continually supports evidence of separateness in the relationship.
Wow, this is like ground shattering. But where does the other person come in, helping us feel better, soothe us, co-regulate,
Well, that's nice, but maybe it's not their responsibility because they don't have the power. We can't save our partner from their life. Our partner had their issues before we ever met them. And if our partner's not the cause of our issues, they're never going to be the solution to our issues. So basically, we commit to this never resolvable alternation back and forth between trying to take such good care of ourselves that we have no accumulating resentment, blame, or complaint, or such good care of ourselves, we can actually keep our heart open. That's what we can do. And then also half the story is being kind to our partner, supporting them, but that's different than saving them from their issue. And we just count on our partner triggering us off and on as long as we're together, because our partner's guaranteed to force out into the open any of our unresolved, unconscious issues about intimacy, because we've hired them to be the location of exactly what we don't want to experience in ourselves. So of course they're going to trigger it. So in addition to wanting to kill our partner, we can gradually also develop some appreciation for the opportunity to use our intimate relationship as a vehicle of waking up or personal growth.
Yeah. But that again requires maturity and personal responsibility and a sense of agency.
Well, it requires that as a practice. We can't flip a switch and suddenly have it as an accomplishment. But at any second, we can commit to practice.
Wow, this is like deeper and more complicated than I thought. But so we are basically responsible for our own experience.
Well, that's a view. It's not objectively true.
Yes. No, I subscribe to this view.
Okay. Well, let's say, yeah. That's good. You and I would have some agreement. But
but a lot of people disagree with that view.
Yeah. So that might not be a useful view for them.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, I can keep you, forever and talk about all those interesting, intriguing topics, but I want to be respectful of your time. And I'm so honored that you carved out time to speak with me on a Saturday.
Oh, sure.
This was such a treat. Your voice will resonate in my mind as I'm moving through my day. Your words, your tone of voice.
Well, don't tell anybody that.
No. And I hope this was useful for the listener. It might be a little dense, but the best part of the podcast is they can listen and re-listen and pause and take notes and take it all in. And some of my community members who have worked with me are not so unfamiliar with those things that we discussed, because I also believe in those things, maybe not in the complicated language that you use and convey, more philosophical view, language. But I would love to hear what the listener thinks about this episode. And I hope they won't unsubscribe from the podcast.
Yes, I hope so. You can blame me if they do.
No, I'll take personal responsibility. Oh, thank you so much. It's truly been a treat. Yeah.
Oh, well, thank you. I enjoy talking about these, so thank you for the invitation. And also just want to thank you and any of the people listening, because I'm always actually touched when somebody is using their rather precious time in their life to try to be more wakeful and more kind to themselves and others. So, I'd like to thank you and all the people listening, just for the efforts you're making.
No, thank you so much. I appreciate that. That's so meaningful and heartwarming. Have a fantastic day. I will have, links in the show notes for your website, for your book. And we may do a book club in the community. Let's see. We have a monthly book club, pod club. Let's see if people are open to the idea. So thank you so much again, Bruce.
Well, thank you. Nice to meet you too.